Greetings, traveler of hours. I am the Watcher. Before we drift into the past, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I read every note before I rest. I am the Watcher, and I remember what the world forgets. I have lingered at the edge of hearths, beneath low timbered beams, and in the hush between dreams for longer than time recalls. I have stood in the corners of stone chambers where rushes rustled faintly under the tread of bare feet, and the smell of tallow mingled with wood smoke. I have seen candles gutter and die, leaving the world in that special darkness that belongs only to the hours before dawn. Tonight, you and I shall drift together through the long and haunted shadow of medieval sleep. There are truths hidden in the hours between dusk and morning, truths of sacred dreams, of strange companions, of little rituals that softened the dark. We shall wander through chambers of straw and skin, down cloistered corridors where bells break the silence, and along moonlit roads where sleepers rest with one eye open. If my voice brings you comfort, you may choose to follow me and drift beside me through the ages. Let us begin. In those days, night was not one single stretch of unbroken rest, as you may know it now. It was a thing divided like the turning of an hourglass, two halves with a shadowed space between. The first sleep was the anchor, the deep sinking into warmth and weight after the day's labor was finished. I have watched men come home from the fields with soil still clinging to their boots, women carrying baskets of grain or folded linen from the riverbank, their shoulders bowed not in defeat, but in the quiet pride of work well done. As the sky faded from gold to the ash blue of twilight, the household drew inward. Doors were barred with wooden beams. Shutters were pulled against the cold. Animals settled into their straw. Within the house, sleep began slowly. There were prayers first, murmured with heads bowed toward a small wooden crucifix or an image of a saint. A candle might be left burning for a moment, just long enough to guide the last hands through their nightly tasks. The rushes on the floor, strewn with dried herbs to sweeten the air, rustled under the feet of those preparing for rest. Then came the laying down. Beds were not what you know today. For most, they were sacks filled with straw, the sound of them crunching softly beneath woolen blankets. In the larger households, such as the homes of guild masters or well-placed merchants, there might be a feather mattress. Though even these were heavy and uneven, their comfort dependent on constant shaking and turning. Pillows, if they existed at all, were stuffed with whatever could be spared. Feathers, wool, sometimes even dry leaves. People shared warmth. A husband and wife, a child tucked against their parents, even servants sleeping at the foot of a master's bed, all together under the same blankets. Privacy was a rare luxury, warmth a far more pressing need. The darkness was complete once the last light was snuffed. Without the silver spill of moonlight through a chink in the shutter, the room dissolved into blackness so whole it felt like another substance, thick enough to press against the eyes. The first sleep was heavy, pulling the mind deep into its earliest dreams. I have watched this descent, quiet as breath. The slow slackening of limbs, the loosening of hands that had held tools all day, the way even the sternest brow softened. The body, cooled by the chill of the night, curled into itself like a creature in a burrow. In the countryside, the first sleep often began soon after dusk. With no artificial light to push back the night, the hours of wakefulness between sunset and bed were few. In winter, this meant slipping under blankets while the last embers still glowed in the hearth, knowing the stars would will overhead while you lay hidden in the folds of straw and cloth. And yet, this first sleep was not the night entire. Sometime after midnight, there would be a stirring, an instinct older than memory. Eyes would open, voices would murmur, and the middle hours would begin. But that is for the next chapter. For now, imagine the hush. Outside the walls, frost tightens over the thatch. A fox pads silently past the henhouse. The wind rattles the latch but does not enter. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of wool, tallow, and herbs dried in the summer months to guard against winter illness. Somewhere, the slow breathing of your bedfellow mingles with the creak of settling timbers. And as I stand at the threshold, unseen, I know you have entered the first sleep, deep, silent, and watched by more than you will ever know. It begins quietly, not with alarm or summons, but with the slow surfacing of the mind, as though dreams themselves have grown too heavy to carry. The body stirs, eyes open to darkness. There is no confusion, no fear. This waking is expected, woven into the rhythm of the night like the pause between two lines of a hymn. In those centuries before the bright flood of artificial light, people rose naturally sometime after midnight. It was the still hour, the breathing space between first and second sleep. The air by then had cooled. Embers in the hearth glowed red but gave little warmth. If there was moonlight, it silvered the edges of beams and rafters, glancing across the uneven folds of blankets. If the sky was clouded, the blackness was so complete that one could not tell whether the eyes were open or closed. I have seen many uses for these hours. In cottages and longhouses, the waking was practical. Tending to an infant, checking on the animals, adding wood to the fire. Some rose to kneel in the cold and whisper prayers, believing that words spoken in this liminal hour had greater reach toward heaven. Others sought softer company. A husband might draw closer to his wife. Quiet talk would pass between them, voices hushed so as not to wake the rest of the household. Children, half asleep, might wander from one bed to another seeking warmth. In winter, the shuffling of feet over rush-strewn floors was a common sound in these middle hours. There was also work done by night. Bakers often began their labor between sleeps, so that bread would be ready by morning. Midwives kept vigil over the laboring, their ears attuned to every cry and silence. The devout read from their psalters by candlelight, the flame flickering over pages stiffened by years of use. But not all activity was holy. I have seen gamblers huddled in tavern corners while the rest of the town lay dormant, dice tumbling in the shadows. I have seen those who crept from one home to another, seeking the kind of warmth not spoken of in daylight. And I have watched the solitary, those unable to return to rest, sit at the edge of their straw mattress and gaze at the door as though expecting a knock that never comes. The air of the in-between was different, quieter than day, yet not as innocent as the first sleep. Time seemed to stretch here, loosened from its grip. A single candle could hold back the dark for hours, its wax running in slow rivulets while thoughts wandered freely. When at last drowsiness returned, it was not the heavy plunge of the earlier rest but a gentle yielding. The second sleep was lighter, touched more easily by dreams. And these dreams, they often carried messages, or so it was believed. For in this time, when the world itself seemed to pause, the veil between the seen and the unseen was thought to grow thin. I have watched countless faces in that return to slumber, lips parting to speak a word only they could hear, brows knitting in unspoken worry, a sudden smile flickering in the dim. Somewhere, a rooster might call too early. Somewhere else, the bell of a monastery might toll for matins, waking those whose prayers would weave into the last hours before dawn. And then, the night resumed its slow retreat, drawing the second sleep over all like a woolen cloak. The bed, as you might imagine it now, was a far cry from what most souls knew in those older centuries. Comfort was not absent, but it was of a different kind, measured not in softness, but in shelter, warmth, and the knowledge that one would not be lying on the bare earth. I have stood at the edges of these beds, watching the small labors that went into their making. In the humblest cottages, the bed was no more than a coarse linen sack stuffed with straw, oat chaff, or dried rushes. Each autumn, the stuffing was replaced, for the summer's heat brought dampness and the creeping life of vermin. The change was a small ritual, the scent of fresh straw filling the room, the sound of it being shaken into corners, tamped down and stitched shut. The frame, if there was one, might be hewn from rough timber, its joints pegged together without nails. But many beds were nothing more than pallets on the floor, raised slightly from the cold by a scattering of rushes. A rope lattice sometimes served as a base, woven tightly and drawn taut with a wooden key. From this comes the saying "sleep tight," for a loose rope made the night long and uncomfortable. In larger houses, the mattress might be stuffed with wool or even feathers. Yet even this luxury carried its own burdens. The weight of the thing, the endless turning and shaking to keep it from becoming uneven, and the faint smell of the life it once held. Sheets were rare for the poor, and for many, The only covering was a single heavy blanket or fur. But perhaps the most telling part of the bed was not its frame nor its stuffing, but its company. A bed was seldom a solitary place. Parents slept beside children, siblings pressed together under the same cover, servants at their master's feet. Guests, expected or otherwise, were given space where they could find it, for the night air was feared as much as the discomfort of crowding. I have watched a household of 6 share one bed, each curling into the smallest shape possible, their breaths mingling in the dark. The heat they generated together was their truest defense against winter's bite. Privacy was a thought for daylight. At night, closeness was survival. Over all of this lay the coverings. Woolen blankets, patched and darned year after year, or furs pulled from storage in the coldest months. In poorer homes, a cloak might serve as a blanket, still carrying the scent of the road or the hearth fire. The sounds of such beds were many. The creak of wood or rope under shifting bodies, the faint sigh of straw settling, the rustle of cloth when a sleeper turned. And there was always the smell. Straw and wool, human sweat, the faint perfume of dried herbs scattered among the rushes to keep pests at bay. These beds, humble as they were, held the heart of the night. They were where prayers were whispered before sleep, where infants were rocked, where the sick lay waiting for morning. They were the place of birth and death alike, the one constant to which every life returned, night after night. And so, when the second sleep took hold once more, it did so upon these simple sanctuaries, beds of straw and skin, imperfect yet enduring, cradling the weary until dawn's first pale light. Not all who lay their heads to rest in the medieval world did so among kin. The roads were long, and the night was a dangerous thing to meet unprepared. Inns, wayhouses, monasteries, and even private homes opened their doors, sometimes out of charity, sometimes for coin, and in these places, strangers slept side by side. I have lingered in the upper rooms of a market town inn, where the air was thick with the scent of ale from the hall below. Here, a merchant from the coast might share a bed with a traveling mason, their conversation in the evening reduced to mumbled exchanges about the weather, the road, or the price of wool. The straw beneath them was fresh only in the seasons when trade was good. More often, it was a mix of the old and the new, carrying the smell of many previous occupants. In monasteries, the arrangement was more orderly. Pilgrims were sometimes given space in the dormitory, lying shoulder to shoulder with the brothers, separated by nothing but a blanket. The quiet was broken only by the soft breathing of dozens of men and, now and then, the far-off tolling of a bell for the midnight offices. Yet even here, I have seen rest disturbed, not by noise, but by the unfamiliarity of bodies close enough to touch, by the rustle of cloth and the turn of limbs in the darkness. In the countryside, travelers often sought shelter in farmhouses. Charity was a sacred duty, and it was not uncommon for a stranger to be invited to share the family bed for warmth's sake. It was an awkward intimacy, two lives intersecting for only a handful of hours, bound by the shared need for rest and protection from the cold. There were dangers, too. I have stood in the shadowed corner of a roadside inn and seen the mistrust in the eyes of a man trying to sleep beside another whose hand never strayed far from his knife. Not all strangers were honest, and not all beds were safe. Some learned to sleep lightly, waking at the faintest movement. Others bound their purses to their belts, tucking them beneath their bodies as they slept. But there was also a quiet camaraderie in these shared beds. I have heard two strangers whisper stories until both drifted into dreams, their words blending with the creak of the bed frame. I have seen a weary pilgrim wake to find a blanket pulled higher over his shoulders by the hand of a man whose name he never knew. In such moments, the bed became more than a place of rest. It was a fragile truce, a meeting ground where the rules of the day softened. Whether in a crowded city inn or a lonely farmhouse on the edge of the moor, these nights were part of the traveler's unwritten history, the times when warmth, trust, and necessity overcame the distance between strangers. And when the morning came, they would part, one east, one west, leaving the bed behind for others to share, and the memory of the night to fade into the quiet recesses of the road. In the long hours after dusk, the bed was not always sought for sleep. I have wandered through narrow streets where the light of a single candle slipped between warped shutters, and the sound of low voices carried into the dark. Within, the bed might hold not the innocence of rest, but the weight of human longing, secrecy, or transaction. The church spoke often of the dangers of the night, how idleness after sunset led to moral decay, how the body, once beneath blankets, might seek pleasures forbidden. Priests warned against the devil's hour between the first and second sleep, when thoughts could wander unchecked. And yet, for all the warnings, the human heart did as it has always done. It reached for warmth, for comfort, for closeness. In the brothels of great towns, the beds were worn from constant use, the straw inside flattened to a thin mat. The air was heavy with perfumes meant to mask the truth, and the quilts were stitched from scraps of finer houses. Here, sleep was rare, transactions left little time for it. Still, in the rare quiet between customers, a woman might curl upon the bed like any other soul, holding her own arms against the night chill. In more respectable homes, the sin was subtler, hidden under the same blanket as a lawful spouse. Adultery was a crime of both body and spirit, but in the shadows before dawn, the whisper of silk, the press of a hand, and the turning of the heart could feel beyond the reach of judgment. There were other forms of transgression as well, gamblers lying awake after a night of dice and drink, their thoughts restless as they clutched coins won or lost, thieves spending their first hours of darkness counting the spoils taken while the rest of the town lay in honest slumber. Even sloth, the sin of inaction, found a nest in the bed, as some lingered long past sunrise, letting the day's work slip further from reach. I have stood at the foot of noble beds draped in costly hangings, and I have crouched beside pallets on tavern floors. Sin knows no station. The same restlessness, the same hunger, the same moments of surrender are found in both silk and sackcloth. And in the stillness that follows, when breath slows and eyes close, the bed returns to its oldest purpose, taking back the sinner and the saint alike into its quiet hold. For in the medieval night, the bed was both a mirror and a confessional. It showed the truth of one's desires, even as it swallowed those truths into the soft darkness before morning. There are those who lie in beds but do not fall into the deep waters of the first sleep. I have watched them, the restless ones, turning upon their straw, shifting under woolen blankets, listening for sounds that are not there. The house around them has surrendered to slumber, but their minds remain open, their thoughts moving like moths around a guttering flame. In the medieval night, sleeplessness was more than discomfort. It was a condition touched by superstition and fear. To be unable to sleep was to risk the intrusion of unwelcome thoughts, even unwelcome spirits. Physicians of the age prescribed warm possets of milk and honey, or small sachets of chamomile and lavender tied near the pillow. Yet many believed that wakefulness was not merely of the body, but of the soul, that the sleepless were kept so because something or someone watched them. I have been the silent witness to these vigils. In cottages, a sleepless mother might lie listening to her child's breathing, fearing it might stop. In the homes of merchants, a man might stare at the rafters above, thinking of debts and bargains yet unpaid. In castles, the sleepless noble might pace the floor, his slippers whispering against the rushes, unable to quiet the memory of a wrong committed or an oath broken. There was also the watching that came from without. In the dimness, an insomniac might imagine eyes upon them, saints and painted icons staring down from the wall, the gaze of carved angels on a bed's headboard, or worse, the invisible presence of something unholy. The tales told by hearthfire did not help. Stories of the night hag who sat upon the chest, or of spirits who stood beside the bed until the cock crowed. In some places, it was thought unwise to look toward a window when wakeful in the night, lest one meet the eyes of something waiting there. Curtains, if they existed, were drawn tight. Doors were barred not only against thieves, but against what could slip through the smallest gap between frame and wall. And so the sleepless lay still, feigning rest, as though pretending to be asleep might fool the watcher, be it ghost, saint, or demon. Often, the long hours until the second sleep were filled with prayer, whispered so softly that the words dissolved into breath. Others counted their own heartbeats, or traced familiar patterns in the darkness to reassure themselves that they were still in the same world they had entered when the candle was snuffed. When at last drowsiness came, it was a fragile surrender. The second sleep was shallow, easily broken, and haunted by dreams in which the waking fears took form. But even this was a mercy, for it closed the eyes of the sleepless and, for a time, hid them from whatever watched. Far from the crowded inns and quiet farmhouses, the night had a different shape within the monastery walls. Here, sleep was never meant to be whole. The hours of rest bent themselves around the greater rhythm of prayer, and the darkness between first and second sleep was not for dreaming, but for devotion. I have walked the long stone corridors of these places, the air cool and faintly scented with beeswax from the candles. The beds, narrow, hard, and without ornament, were arranged in rows within the dormitory. Each monk slept in his habit, ready to rise at the sound of the bell. And rise they did, for when the clapper struck in the deep hours before dawn, it carried not just through the halls, but through the soul. Matins was the first great office of the day, though it began while the night still ruled. The brothers would stir, swing their legs over the bed's edge, and stand in silence for a moment before moving as one toward the chapel. Sandaled feet whispered over the flagstones. The only other sound was the steady tolling that marked each heartbeat of their passage. The chapel itself was a world apart from the sleeping dormitory. Cold, vast, and filled with shadow, it held a kind of listening stillness, as though the stones themselves awaited the words to come. Candles flickered on tall iron stands, their light trembling over carved wood and painted saints. When the chanting began, it rose in waves, Latin words flowing like water through the nave, each note echoing softly from the vaulted ceiling. This was the monk's wakefulness. Not idle, not fretful, but a deliberate breaking of the night, offered as a gift to God. The prayers stretched on, weaving together psalms, hymns, and readings until the darkness outside had shifted toward its first pale gray. Then, when the final amen faded, they returned to their beds, sliding once more into the narrow warmth for what remained of the night. Not all returned easily to rest. The chill of the chapel clung to them, as did the echo of the chants. Some lay awake, tracing in their minds the words they had spoken, wondering if heaven had truly heard. Others drifted at once into second sleep, their dreams softened by the rhythm of prayer. I have seen this pattern repeated night after night, year after year, until the very body learned the hours like a familiar path. For these men, the midnight bell was not an interruption. It was the heartbeat of their vocation, the sound that kept their days and nights aligned with the eternal. And so, while the rest of the world slumbered unbroken, the monastery kept its vigil, the light of its candles and the rise of its voices holding back the vast silence of the medieval dark. The medieval night was rarely warm. Stone walls held the day's chill, timbered ceilings gathered drafts, and the hearth, once the fire burned low, gave only a faint red glow. In such hours, the cold moved upward from the floor, creeping through straw-filled mattresses, finding its way to toes and fingers first. I have stood at the foot of beds where sleepers drew their knees tight against their chests, curling into the smallest space possible to trap what heat they could. Heavy blankets were a treasure, but even the thickest wool could not always shield against winter's bite. Furs were prized fox, sheepskin, even old pelts sewn together into patchwork coverings, but they were costly and for most out of reach. One solution was simple: to share the bed. Husbands and wives, children, servants, and guests all pressed together beneath a single covering, the mingled heat of bodies creating a small island of comfort in the frozen dark. It was not unusual for feet to seek other feet, instinctively finding the warmest place. In inns, strangers who shared a bed might do the same without a word, the moment too practical to be questioned. Yet warmth was not only drawn from flesh and fabric. Many sought it from a different source, saints who, in life or in legend, were known for their intercession in matters of comfort and health. I have seen small wooden carvings of St. Lawrence, the patron of cooks and, curiously, of warmth, placed near the bed in hopes that his spirit might banish the cold. Some called upon St. Blaise, asking him to guard against the chill that could settle into the chest and become illness. In certain regions, charms were whispered before sleep, prayers that mingled with folk superstition, promising that a saint's blessing would keep the sleeper warm until dawn. A small relic, a scrap of cloth, a chip of bone, might be tucked beneath the pillow for the same purpose. Whether it was the power of the relic or the comfort of belief, many swore it worked. There were also more earthly tricks. Some filled earthenware bottles with heated stones or water, wrapping them in cloth before slipping them under the blankets. Others set their shoes close to the hearth before bed, so that in the morning they would be warm when the first step was taken. In wealthier houses, servants might warm a master's bed with a brass pan filled with embers, sliding it between the sheets before retiring for the night. Still, even with all these measures, the cold remained a familiar companion. In the quiet hours before dawn, a sleeper might stir, draw the blanket closer, and whisper a name of a loved one, of a saint, before sinking again into dreams. And whether it was the wool, the body beside them, or the faith they carried into the dark, the warmth would hold at least until morning. In the medieval night, sleep was not always eager to come. And so, people called upon the quiet allies of the garden and the still room, plants whose scent, taste, or smoke could soften the mind and draw it toward rest. I have watched these preparations countless times. A woman in a cottage, stooping over a small wooden chest where dried bundles of herbs hung from the lid. A monk in the infirmary, measuring powders into a clay cup with care. A merchant's wife, shaking lavender buds into a linen pouch to be placed beneath her husband's pillow before he retired. Lavender was a favorite. Its sharp, clean perfume thought to clear troubled thoughts and calm the heartbeat. Chamomile, steeped into a pale golden tea, was sipped slowly before bed, the warmth of it traveling down into the bones. Valerian root, with its bitter earthiness, was used more cautiously, for it could coax a deep, heavy sleep that some feared might be too difficult to wake from. These herbs were not only taken by mouth. Many were burned, the smoke curling into the air in thin blue threads. Sweet woodruff, rosemary, and even dried rose petals were cast into the small hearths of bedchambers, their scent mingling with the smell of wool and rushes. The smoke was thought not only to soothe, but to purify, driving away foul humors and unseen spirits that might trouble the sleeper. Some households hung garlands of herbs near the bed. Dill to keep away nightmares, rue to guard against witchcraft, marjoram for peace. In summer, fresh sprigs were laid among the mattress straw, releasing their fragrance whenever a sleeper turned. In winter, the dried remains of the same plants whispered faintly when moved, their scent fainter but still present. In towns, apothecaries sold small cones of perfumed resin, to be burned like incense in the evening hours. The wealthy might import exotic scents, sandalwood, myrrh, frankincense, whose aroma carried with it a hint of far-off lands and the belief in powers beyond the local and familiar. But perhaps the most potent effect of these herbs and smokes was not in their chemistry, but in the ritual itself. The measuring, the steeping, the tying of a sprig with thread. All these acts slowed the mind, preparing it for stillness. To breathe in the warm, spiced air was to take part in a tradition as old as memory, the making of a safe and scented space in which to surrender to the night. And so, as the fire dimmed and the herb smoke faded into the rafters, the sleeper would pull the blanket close, the last trace of lavender or chamomile still lingering in the breath, and drift toward dreams, gently carried by the plants that grew in the sunlit hours of another day. In the medieval world, a dream was seldom considered a meaningless wandering of the mind. It was a message, though from whom or from where depended on the dreamer, the dream, and the beliefs that wrapped around them like the blankets of the night. I have stood by the bedsides of peasants and kings alike, watching their faces twist or soften in slumber. The farmer who dreamt of a field full of weeds might take it as a warning of bad harvests to come. The noblewoman who dreamt of clear water flowing toward her house might wake believing that good fortune was on its way. Dreams were maps to the unseen, if one knew how to read them. Interpretation was an art, and often a guarded one. There were books, handwritten and passed carefully from hand to hand, that listed the meanings of common dreams. To dream of a wolf was ill luck, unless the wolf fled, in which case it was a sign of victory. To dream of teeth falling out was to expect a death in the family. A dream of gold could mean wealth or betrayal, depending on whether one touched it or merely saw it. Clergy sometimes treated dreams with suspicion, warning that the devil himself could send visions to lead the faithful astray. Yet even in monasteries, I have heard whispered accounts of brothers who woke from a dream with an insight or a prayer that seemed not their own. Saints, it was said, might choose the night as their moment to speak, when the mind was soft and open. Dreams could also be sought deliberately. Some pilgrims slept upon the tombs of holy men, hoping that the saint would visit them in the night and offer guidance. Others drank infusions of certain herbs, mugwort, vervain before bed to sharpen their visions. These incubation dreams were treasured, told aloud to confessors or scribes who could set them down in ink. But not all dreams were welcome. Nightmares were seen as more than fears of the mind. They were visitations, sometimes from demons, sometimes from the restless dead. A sleeper who awoke in terror might spit upon the floor, whispering a charm to drive away the lingering shadow of the vision. In the still dark morning after such dreams, the images could cling like smoke, shaping the choices of the day. A farmer might delay planting. A merchant might cancel a journey. A mother might keep her child close, all because of what was seen between the two sleeps. And so, as the medieval night surrendered to dawn, dreams were carried into the waking hours, folded into decisions, prayers, and fears, lingering long after the bed had cooled. For in that world, the line between sleep and prophecy was as thin as the fabric that covered the sleeper's face. The pillow, humble as it seems, was more than a cushion for the head. In many places, it was a hiding place, soft, close, and always near the sleeping mind. Beneath its weight, charms, tokens, and curious objects rested, waiting to do their quiet work through the hours of darkness. I have watched the preparation of such pillows. In the candle's last glow, a hand would slip something small into the linen case. A twist of paper inscribed with a verse from the Psalms, folded tight. A sprig of rue, brittle from drying, to ward away witchcraft. A piece of iron, small enough not to disturb the head, for protection against spirits. Sometimes it was a saint's relic, a fragment of cloth, a bead from a rosary, that was believed to bring good dreams or safe passage through the night. The purpose of these objects was as varied as the sleepers themselves. Lovers tucked small keepsakes under their pillows to dream of one another. Travelers carried tokens from home, believing they would protect them on strange beds in strange towns. Mothers placed protective charms beneath the pillows of their infants to shield them from the night air, thought to bring illness. There were even darker uses. I have seen pillows hide powders meant to trouble another's sleep, slipped there in secret by an enemy or a rival. In certain villages, there was talk of charms that could twist dreams into nightmares, so that the victim would wake unrefreshed and weakened, as though the night had stolen their strength. The pillow was also a place for secrecy. Small coins, keys, or letters could be hidden there, safe from the casual glance. A sleeper might lay their head directly upon such treasures, trusting that no thief would think to search so intimate a place. And then there was the belief that what touched the head in sleep touched the mind. To lie upon a sprig of rosemary was to invite clear dreams. To rest upon lavender was to guard against troubled thoughts. To place a holy book within the pillow was to let the word seep into one's very soul. When morning came, these hidden items were often removed before others could see, restoring the pillow to its innocent form. Yet the sleeper carried into the day the quiet assurance, or the creeping doubt, of what had lain beneath them through the night. For in the medieval world, even the most ordinary object could be a vessel of unseen influence. And there was no place more personal, more private, than the pillow under one's head. Of all the creatures that moved in the medieval imagination, none was stranger as a guardian of sleep than the toad. Small, silent, and unlovely, it nonetheless carried a weight of superstition that could make it an honored, if hidden, companion of the night. I have seen it done. A toad, found near the well or in the damp grass of the garden, would be caught carefully, sometimes by hand, sometimes with a scrap of cloth to avoid direct touch. It might be placed in a small wooden box or a pottery jar with air holes, then set at the threshold of the bedchamber before sleep. There, It was believed to keep out wandering spirits, the evil eye, or the creeping illnesses that moved, unseen, through the air. Some took the belief further. A dried toad, preserved and hardened, might be wrapped in cloth and placed directly under the bed, or even beneath the pillow itself. This, it was said, would draw away fevers, banish nightmares, and protect against those who might wish the sleeper harm. The threshold was important. In the old thinking, doorways were liminal places, neither fully inside nor fully outside, where protective magic was most needed. A toad, living or dead, stationed there became a guardian against whatever might try to cross into the sleeping space. There were other uses more secretive. I have known of charms in which the heart of a toad was dried and kept in a small pouch, worn around the neck at night to guard against night terrors. Such practices were not spoken of openly, for the church frowned upon them as remnants of paganism. Yet they persisted in quiet corners of the countryside, passed from grandmother to granddaughter with a whisper and a warning. Not all saw the toad as merely a ward against harm. In certain places, it was thought that keeping one close at night could draw wealth to the household, as though its slow, patient nature attracted good fortune while the rest of the house slept. And in love charms, the toad's bones, cleaned and kept, were said to influence the dreams of a desired person, bending their thoughts toward the one who placed the charm. When dawn came, the living toad was released back into the grass, often with a small thanks spoken aloud. The dried ones remained hidden under the bed or within a chest, ready to serve again when night fell. And so, in that world of candlelight and shadow, even a humble creature of the marsh could become a silent sentinel, standing watch at the edge of the sleeping world. There were some who did not simply find a toad for the night, but kept them, tended them, almost as one might tend bees or herbs. In the countryside, such people were rare, and they were spoken of with a curious mix of respect and unease. They were not witches, at least not in their own naming, but they understood the ways of these small, watchful creatures better than most. I have stood in the doorways of their homes, smelling the damp earth that clung to the air within. In a corner, there would be a shallow wooden trough filled with moss, damp from a sprinkle of water drawn that morning. Clay jars lined the walls, their lids tied with cloth to allow breath but keep the creatures from wandering. The toad keeper knew when to feed them. Flies caught in summer, worms gathered after rain, and when to let them starve, for a lean toad was thought to have sharper powers. They knew how to dry a toad without losing the form, so that it could be used in charms for decades to come. Such knowledge was not shared freely. A toad keeper might pass on a single charm to a trusted neighbor, a method for placing the creature under the bed of a fevered child, or at the foot of a bridal bed to ensure fertility. Payment could be a coin, a measure of grain, or simply a favor owed for the future. Some kept their toads in darkness, believing that this strengthened their power when brought into the lamplight. Others housed them near a hearth to keep their nature warm, so that they might drive out cold-born illnesses. A few even gave their toads names, speaking to them softly before placing them on their nightly posts. The church watched such practices warily. Priests warned against creatures of the damp being used in place of holy relics. Yet even some clerics, quietly, in private, sought the toad keeper's aid when illness lingered or when a household was troubled by restless dreams. Not all who kept toads did so for protection alone. There were tales of darker uses. Toads turned into vessels for curses, their bodies bound with string and buried at a crossroads, their suffering said to transfer misfortune to an enemy. These stories were told in low voices, and no toad keeper would admit to them. And yet, whether for blessing or bane, the art endured. The toad keeper's hands moved with practiced care, lifting each small body and placing it where it was needed, on the hearthstone, by the threshold, or beneath the pillow of the one who had come seeking aid. When the night closed in and the household lay still, the toads remained, unblinking, unmoving until morning. And I, standing in the corner unseen, could feel the weight of the belief that bound creature and sleeper together, joined in the silent business of guarding dreams. In the medieval night, not all remedies were written in the great books of the apothecaries or the illuminated margins of monastic herbals. Some lived only in breath and memory, passed from one mouth to another, as fleeting and secret as the wind through rushes. These were the whispered remedies, spoken low so that the wrong ears would not hear, for their power lay partly in their secrecy. I have heard them traded between midwives in the still hours after a birth, murmured between two women leaning close at a market stall, or recited by a grandmother to a drowsy child as the fire burned low. Many began with the same words, old invocations that served as a key to open the cure. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Or, in older corners of the land, phrases that bore no mark of the church at all, only the cadence of something older, half forgotten. Some were charms for sleep itself. Saint Agnes, close my eyes till cockcrow, said 3 times with the head turned to the east. A small stone, warmed in the hearth, wrapped in wool, and placed at the foot of the bed. 3 sips of water poured from a vessel kept in moonlight, taken without speaking. Others were for troubled dreams. A sprig of yarrow placed beneath the tongue before sleep, to ensure that no nightmare could take root. The burning of juniper near the bed to drive away the nightmare, that shadowy rider who pressed the sleeper's chest and stole their breath. There were remedies for sickness in the night, fevers that rose after dusk, or coughs that worsened in the dark. A piece of bread baked with fennel seeds eaten before lying down. A ribbon tied loosely around the neck with the knot placed over the sore side. A prayer whispered into a mug of ale, drunk while still warm. These remedies were rarely written because writing could be stolen, copied, or mocked. Spoken words vanished into the air, belonging only to those present in that moment. And so the knowledge passed along the narrowest of paths, shaped slightly by each tongue that carried it, yet holding the same pulse of belief. Sometimes the remedy was only a comfort, the cure lying more in the telling than in the act itself. The sleeper, reassured by the old words and the small ritual, would feel the weight of fear or pain lift enough to allow rest to come. And in this way, the whispered remedies endured, woven into the breath of the living, vanishing with the dead, and forever reshaped by the night's own hand. In the deep centuries before your clocks and constant light, night was not a single unbroken thread. It was 2 pieces, stitched together by a span of wakefulness, a time known to every household, though rarely named aloud. This was the space between first and second sleep. I have drifted through many of these hours. In farmhouses, the waking was gentle. Someone might rise to tend the fire, feeding it a few scraps of kindling so that embers would not die. Another might slip outside to check the animals, the cold biting sharp against skin warmed by blankets. The stars seemed nearer then, the fields a frozen sea of silver frost. In towns, the interval could be livelier. Bakers were already at their ovens, the smell of bread beginning to coil through the narrow streets. A watchman's lantern would pass along the wall, its small flame swaying, marking the hour by the hollow sound of his staff against stone. For many, these were moments for intimacy. Couples whispered in the dark, speaking of plans, fears, or affections they had no words for in the light of day. Others turned to prayer, believing that the stillness of this hour made it especially pleasing to God. A psalm recited between sleeps was thought to carry further into heaven than one spoken in daylight. There were practical uses as well. I have seen women mending clothes by the faint glow of the hearth, their needles catching sparks of light. Men set traps for vermin, repaired tools, or wrote letters in the quiet, dipping quills into ink kept warm in the crook of an elbow. Children sometimes woke, and rather than being hushed back to bed, they were given bread or milk and allowed to play softly until drowsiness returned. Some used the hour for medicine, taking drafts or applying poultices, for it was said the body was more receptive to healing in this interval. Others believed it was the best time to conceive a child, when the mind was still soft with dreams and the body rested yet awake. And always, there was the sense that the world was thinner then, that the silence was not empty but watchful. I have seen candles flicker when no draft stirred, or heard the faint creak of a door that no one opened. To some, this was comforting, the nearness of the divine. To others, it was unsettling, the feeling of being observed by something beyond the reach of sight. When the time felt right, when the first drowsiness returned like a slow tide, people slipped back beneath their blankets. The second sleep was often deeper, richer, carrying them into morning with the lingering softness of the waking hour still in their minds. And so the night was lived in two acts, the middle one quiet but full, like the pause between the verses of a song only the old world remembers. In the medieval night, there were some acts that seemed to belong as much to dream as to waking. One of these was the midnight combing of hair, a practice part beauty, part charm, and wholly bound to the rhythm of the dark. I have seen it in the upper rooms of merchants' houses, in the lamplight of noble chambers, even beside the low hearth of a peasant cottage. A woman would rise in the small hours between first and second sleep, taking up her comb as if drawn by some inner summons. Sometimes the act was practical. Long hair could snarl and mat during the night, and combing eased the tangles before they grew worse. But more often, it was symbolic, a way of ordering not only the hair, but the thoughts and fortunes of the one who combed. The comb itself was rarely plain. Even the humblest wooden one might bear small carvings, while in wealthier homes, ivory or bone teeth were set into handles of polished horn or silver. A comb could be gifted between lovers or passed from mother to daughter, carrying with it the scent of oils and the warmth of many hands. There were beliefs bound to the hour. Combing hair at midnight was said to keep it lustrous, to strengthen the roots, and to ward off headaches. In some places, it was thought to untangle ill luck itself, each pull through the hair loosening knots of misfortune that had tightened during the day. Others whispered that if a woman combed her hair 12 times before a mirror by candlelight at midnight, she might glimpse her future husband's face in the glass. But not all saw it as benign. The church warned against looking into mirrors at night, for the reflection might not always be one's own. To comb hair before such a glass was to invite spirits, curious, envious, or even malicious, to draw near. There were tales of women who felt another's hand upon theirs as they combed, or who saw a shadow in the mirror that moved in perfect time with their own, yet did not match their face. In some households, the midnight comb was part of courtship magic. A lock of hair, combed at that hour and tied with red thread, could be hidden beneath a beloved's pillow to inspire affection. The act was quiet, deliberate, and filled with intent, the steady sound of teeth through hair blending with the faint crackle of the hearth and the breathing of those still asleep. And then, when the comb was set down and the hair smoothed into place, the sleeper returned to bed, carrying the faint perfume of rosemary oil or beeswax polish into the second sleep. Whatever had been sought, beauty, luck, love, or simply a sense of calm, was left to work its will in the hours before dawn. In the day, a mirror was a simple thing, a tool to arrange one's hair, to check the fit of a hood, to ensure the ribbon sat just so at the throat. But in the night, the mirror belonged to another realm entirely, one in which reflection and reality might part ways. I have seen them. Small hand mirrors of polished bronze, silver-backed glass imported at great cost, larger ovals framed in carved oak and hung where they might catch the morning light. By day they were harmless, even prized possessions. But when the candles burned low and the house grew quiet, they were treated with a caution not given to other objects. It was said that the mirror, in darkness, might show more than it ought. Some believed it became a window through which spirits could gaze, curious or hungry. Others feared that the soul itself might stray into its surface during sleep, only to return altered. For this reason, many turned mirrors to the wall or covered them with cloth before going to bed. In some regions, a mirror uncovered at night was thought to draw the attention of the restless dead. The glass could capture the image of a wandering spirit, holding it there until dawn, or worse, allow it to step through into the room. Parents warned children never to look into a mirror after sunset, lest they see what could not be unseen. And yet, there were those who sought the mirror's night face deliberately. Lovers wishing to glimpse their future together might stare into it by the light of a single candle, reciting charms. Seers used it as a scrying glass, seeking visions in its shifting depth. Some young women, comb in hand, believed that if they brushed their hair before a mirror at midnight, the face of their destined love would appear just behind their shoulder. Not all visions were kind. There are tales, too many to dismiss entirely, of those who saw their own face aged, or altered by sorrow, or replaced entirely by another's gaze. The unlucky sometimes swore they saw a shadow within the mirror move after they had stepped away. In noble houses, where such objects were too costly to discard, care was taken to keep them safe from the night's reach. Covers were embroidered with protective symbols. Prayers were whispered when the cloth was drawn over. In humbler dwellings, a simple scrap of linen sufficed, but the act was no less deliberate. A small barrier between the sleeper and whatever might stir in the glass. By morning, the mirror returned to its innocent role, showing only the waking face. Yet those who had glimpsed more than that carried the memory into the day, sometimes never quite certain if it had been dream, vision, or truth caught for an instant between the worlds. In the medieval night, beauty was not left to the daylight alone. Even as the hearth embers dimmed, women, and sometimes men, tended to hair, skin, and breath, believing that the still hours could deepen the effects of their care. Yet such acts, when performed after sunset, stood close to the realm of enchantment. I have seen noble ladies seated before low tables, their mirrors shrouded, yet their hands busy with scented oils, almond for softness, rosemary for strength, rosewater for fragrance. A maid might hold the lamp while the mistress massaged the oil into her hair, the scent mingling with the dry sweetness of rushes on the floor. In humbler cottages, the ritual might be simpler. A rinse with water steeped in marigold or nettle leaves, a comb drawn slowly through hair to bring blood to the scalp. It was believed that beauty tended at night would be stronger by morning, as if the moon itself worked alongside the sleeper. But here was the danger. The same logic that made night a fertile time for beauty also made it ripe for magic. A rival might watch from the shadows and whisper that a woman's midnight oils were not mere cosmetics, but filters designed to ensnare a lover or bend a husband's will. In the courts, where envy was never far, accusations of bewitchment could spring from something as simple as a rose-scented braid at breakfast. Even a man who washed his face with milk under the moon could be suspected of seeking unnatural charm. There were protective measures for such beauty rites. Some women murmured prayers as they braided their hair, binding not only the strands but their own virtue. Others anointed themselves in secret, extinguishing the lamp before the final touches so no one could watch and weave ill wishes into the act. Among the folk remedies, beauty and magic were often intertwined. A paste of crushed violets applied to the face at night was said to lighten the skin, but also to keep away envy's eye. Sleeping with a wreath of fresh herbs was meant to keep the breath sweet and the dreams peaceful, but some whispered it could also make one more alluring to those who dreamed of them in return. I have stood beside beds where beauty slept beside fear, where the perfumed air was heavy with both hope and caution. In the medieval mind, to be beautiful was to be seen, and to be seen was to risk being touched, altered, or claimed by forces beyond the self. And so the night was both a friend and a test. A place where beauty could grow in the soft dark, but where each stroke of the comb and each drop of oil might call not only the admiration of mortals, but the attention of things far stranger. In the medieval night, many sought safety not from locked doors or watchmen's rounds, but from the small, potent things placed near the head and heart. This was talisman sleep, a layering of charms, tokens, and relics meant to hold the darkness at bay. I have seen beds ringed with such guardians. A pouch of salt tied to the bedpost to purify the air and confound spirits. A length of red thread looped beneath the mattress to bind ill fortune before it could touch the sleeper. At the four corners of the bed, sprigs of protective herbs, rue, basil, and vervain, arranged like the points of a compass to direct harm away. The pillow was often the most crowded place of all. Tucked within its linen case might be a saint's relic, a sliver of bone wrapped in silk, or a smooth stone carried from a pilgrimage site. Some placed iron there, small enough not to discomfort the head. A nail, a sewing needle, a ring. Iron was thought to burn the fingers of spirits who reached too close. Around the neck, sleepers might wear amulets on leather cords. Carved jet to absorb envy, amber to guard against sickness, silver to reflect the moon's gentler light. A crucifix lay upon many chests, its weight a familiar reassurance. Children were the most heavily guarded of all. A teething ring carved from coral, hung over the cradle, could protect against both illness and the evil eye. Bells no larger than a fingertip were sewn into swaddling cloth, their faint chime a ward against wandering souls. In some regions, an egg, whole and unbroken, was placed beneath the bed of a newborn to absorb any malice sent its way. Not all talismans were holy. Some came from older, quieter traditions. A hare's foot for luck, a feather from a white goose to ensure peaceful dreams, a coin bearing the face of a long-dead king to keep away thieves both mortal and otherworldly. The church alternated between tolerating and condemning these practices. While relics and blessed objects were encouraged, charms with no scriptural authority were frowned upon, even when their keepers insisted they had worked for generations. Yet, in the privacy of the bedchamber, few made a distinction. Protection was protection, whether it bore a cross or the mark of the hedge witch. And so, the talisman-laden sleeper would drift into the first sleep surrounded by a silent circle of guardians. Whether their power lay in divine intercession, in old magic, or simply in the peace of mind they gave, no one could say for certain. But I have watched many such beds, and I know this: those who believed in their charms slept more deeply than those who had none. In the medieval mind, the barrier between the living and the dead was not so firm as you might think. It was porous, especially in sleep, when the soul was thought to drift free of the body. In that drifting, it might wander far, or be visited by those who had already made the longer journey. I have watched such dreams unfold. A woman stirs in the second sleep, her brow softening as she sees her mother, dead these 5 winters, seated at the foot of the bed. They speak of small things: the garden, the weather, the health of the children. When she wakes, the air still feels warmer at her feet, as if her mother had truly been there. Not all such visits were gentle. Some dreamers saw the dead in forms altered by death, faces pale, clothes wet from the grave, voices thick and distant. These dreams might be warnings of danger, of sickness, of the need to make amends. In such cases, the waking response was swift: a candle lit, a prayer spoken, an offering of bread or alms in the visitor's name. There were rules for dealing with the dead in dreams. One must never accept food or drink from them, lest one's own soul be drawn too far from the body to return. To follow them across a river or through a doorway was equally perilous. But to listen, to receive their counsel, was sometimes a blessing, for the dead were believed to see further than the living. Some sought these dreams on purpose. A mourner might sleep upon the grave of the beloved, or rest with a token of theirs beneath the pillow: a ring, a lock of hair, a scrap of clothing. Certain herbs, mugwort, yew, and black poppy, were thought to thin the veil, making a visit more likely. But this was dangerous work, for one could not control who might come through. The church taught caution, warning that the dead seen in dreams might be demons in disguise. Yet even monks recorded visions in which departed brothers appeared, offering comfort or guidance. In the great dream books of the time, entire sections were devoted to such encounters, with careful notes on how to tell a true spirit from a false one. I have stood beside the beds of those who woke weeping after such a dream, clutching the memory as if it were the last touch of the hand they loved. Others woke pale and shaken, unwilling to speak of what they had seen, as though naming it might make it return. In the medieval night, the dead were never far. In dreams, they were as near as a whisper against the ear, as close as the warmth on the other side of the blankets. And whether the dreamer woke in joy or in dread, they always woke changed. In the medieval night, there were some who did not lie still from dusk to dawn. Their eyes might open, but their sight was clouded, their steps sure, yet unchosen. These were the sleepwalkers, moving through shadowed rooms and silent streets as if drawn by a thread unseen. I have followed them many times. A boy of 12 rises from his straw bed, steps over his sleeping brothers, and walks out into the frosted yard. His bare feet leave prints that glitter in the moonlight. He climbs the low stone wall, gazes toward the forest for a long moment, then turns back and returns to bed, never once waking. Such wanderings were met with both fear and fascination. Some believed the soul left the body during sleepwalking, leading it like a puppet along paths known only to the spirit. Others said it was the body itself, restless with unspent humors, seeking balance in movement. There were darker whispers, too, that sleepwalkers were touched by witchcraft, their motions guided by unseen hands. In certain villages, it was considered dangerous to wake a sleepwalker suddenly. To do so, it was said, might startle the soul before it had fully returned, leaving the body empty or the mind confused forever. Instead, the wanderer was gently turned, guided back to bed without breaking the fragile thread of their dream state. Not all paths were harmless. I have seen a man climb onto a thatched roof, moving as if in daylight, while those below held their breath. Another crossed a narrow footbridge over black water, reaching the far side just as the cock crowed. In such cases, families sometimes tied a cord from the sleeper's ankle to the bedpost, not tight, only enough to halt them before danger. The church viewed sleepwalking with caution, for it blurred the boundary between waking and dreaming, body and soul. Some clerics saw it as a sign of holiness, proof that the spirit could act apart from flesh, while others feared it as a symptom of possession. There are records of priests sprinkling holy water on the doorways of sleepwalkers' homes to keep them from straying too far. Yet there were those who saw beauty in it. A wife, watching her husband rise at night to pace the moonlit garden, believed he walked with angels. A mother, seeing her daughter trace patterns in the air with her hands, whispered that she was dancing with saints in her dreams. By morning, most sleepwalkers remembered nothing. They awoke as they had lain down, unaware of the distances they had traveled or the eyes that had watched them pass. Only the marks, the footprints in the frost, the shifted chair, the open door, told the story of their wandering. And I, who never sleep, have walked beside them all, my steps silent on the same path, knowing they will never know they had a companion in their midnight journey. In the long centuries before your lamps dimmed the sky, the moon was more than light. It was a presence, a shifting, watchful eye whose phases marked not only the sowing of seeds and the timing of journeys, but the quality of the night's rest itself. I have watched the sleeping world under every face of the moon. In the fullness of her round, there was brightness enough to see the pattern of leaves on the ground, and some said this light stirred restlessness. Farmers spoke of lying awake under a full moon's glare, thoughts turning like the water wheel even in the still hours. In some villages, it was believed the full moon loosened the mind's tether, making sleepwalkers more active and dreams more vivid. The new moon, dark and hidden, was another matter. Without its silver spill, the night was deeper, thicker, and sleep came sooner. Some claimed the new moon was the safest time to rest, free from the moon's meddling influence. Others feared it, saying that darkness so complete belonged to spirits who walked unseen. Waxing moons were thought to build the body's strength in sleep, drawing health into the bones as the light grew night by night. Waning moons, by contrast, were seen as a time for purging, when fevers could be sweated out and troubled dreams banished. It was no accident that many chose to begin a course of herbal remedies or prayer vigils at a waxing moon, and to end them when the light had nearly vanished. In towns, some people turned their beds so their heads faced away from the window, claiming the moon's light could sour the complexion or dry the eyes. In the countryside, curtains of rough wool or linen were drawn for the same reason. And yet there were those who sought her light deliberately, sleeping with shutters open to let it fall on the face, believing it could whiten the skin, cure melancholy, or even grant visions. There were warnings, too. Children were told not to gaze at the full moon before sleep, lest they dream of madness or be moonstruck, a word that could mean anything from fainting fits to lingering sorrow. Some believed the moon could call to certain souls, especially those born under her brightest phases, urging them out into the fields at night. The church did not wholly condemn such ideas, for the moon was part of God's creation, and her phases helped reckon the dates of holy feasts. Yet the clergy discouraged placing too much trust in her influence, reminding the faithful that light and dark alike were under divine will. Still, the old habits endured. I have seen a mother glance at the sky before tucking her child in, muttering to herself whether it was a good moon for sleep. And I have seen the same mother, years later, lie awake under its light, wondering if the dreams she dreamed were hers, or the moon's own making. In the medieval night, the woodline was a threshold, a border not only of land but of safety. Beyond it, trees stood like a wall of shadow, and between their trunks the imagination could place anything. Many feared that witches moved there after sunset, gathering herbs, whispering charms, and watching the windows of those who slept too near. I have seen the stories grow from a single sighting. A lone woman walking at the edge of the forest at dusk, her cloak pulled tight, her head bent. By the next day, her steps have been measured in whispers. She was seen near the baker's house, they say, and his cow took ill that night. She looked toward the miller's window, and his daughter began to waste away. The woodline was where fires might be glimpsed after midnight, small, flickering lights that moved and disappeared. To some, these were simply woodcutters or hunters. To others, they were gatherings of those who made pacts under the trees, their fires the only witness to forbidden rites. Not all witches were feared for malice. There were those who lived at the forest's edge and were sought in daylight for cures, blessings, and midwifery. But even these could inspire unease after dark. A charm given for sleep might be accepted with thanks in the afternoon, yet cause restlessness if remembered at night. The stories carried warnings. Children were told never to follow a sound into the wood after sunset, for a witch's voice could mimic a loved one's. Travelers were advised to keep to the center of the road and avoid looking too long at the treeline, where eyes might look back. Some households set protections for the night. Iron nails driven into door frames, sprigs of rowan above the lintel, ashes from the hearth scattered across the threshold, so no one could enter without leaving a trace. If footprints were found in the morning, bare, small, and pointed at the toes, there was talk of a visit. The church condemned belief in the witches' night wanderings, and yet in the same breath warned against the devil's servants moving under cover of darkness. Priests spoke of keeping candles lit until midnight, or of placing holy water on windowsills that faced the forest. I have watched the woodline under every phase of the moon, and I tell you this, sometimes it is empty but for the wind and the owls. And sometimes something does move between the trunks, too steady for an animal, too silent for a person wide awake. Those who sleep nearby may never know whether the dreams that trouble them came from their own mind, or from the gaze that lingered just beyond the trees. In the deep hours before dawn, there were those who woke without waking, aware of the room around them, yet unable to move. The air grew heavy, the breath caught in the chest, and a weight settled upon them. In the medieval world, this was not a quirk of the body, but an intruder, the incubus. I have stood in such chambers when it came. The shutters were closed, the fire long dead, and the sleeper's face grew pale as though something unseen had leaned close. They could not cry out. They could not lift their hands. Some felt a pressure at the throat, others a presence pressing them down into the straw as if the very night itself had grown a body. The incubus was said to visit both men and women, though its attentions were feared more in the latter. It was believed to be a demon that sought the body's warmth, sapping strength or planting unholy desires. There were other tales, darker still, that it could leave a seed of misfortune, a shadow upon the soul that clung for years. Women who woke from such encounters sometimes swore they felt the mattress shift as it withdrew. Men spoke of dreams that left them shamed and unsettled, as though a choice had been made for them in the dark. And always there was the sense of being watched, even after the pressure lifted. The church offered prayers of deliverance for such afflictions, and some priests taught that a crucifix hung over the bed could keep the demon at bay. In the countryside, other measures were taken. Knives or shears placed under the pillow, iron keys under the mattress, sprigs of rue or fennel hung by the bedstead. Some even slept with a lamp burning low, believing the incubus feared light. There were skeptics even then, who said the incubus was no demon at all but a malady of the blood or a dream too vivid. Yet these same skeptics often kept a charm by their own bedside, just in case. Not all encounters ended in terror. A rare few claimed the incubus brought visions, or whispered truths in their ear, though such talk was dangerous and rarely shared beyond trusted company. By morning, the chamber looked unchanged. The door remained barred, the hearth cold, the window still latched. And yet the sleeper knew, by the lingering taste of fear, or the strange heat in their limbs, that something had visited and left them not entirely as they were before. In the medieval night, not every unbidden presence was cause for dread. There were those who spoke, quietly, reverently, of waking within a dream to find a saint beside them. Such encounters were not rare, though they were treated with the caution due to anything touched by the divine. I have seen these dreams take many shapes. A shepherd sleeps on a hillside and finds himself in a sunlit meadow, though the stars are above him. There, a man in coarse robes appears, his staff tipped with flowers instead of iron. The shepherd wakes with the scent of blossoms in his hair and a certainty that Saint Joseph has promised protection for his flock. A widow in a cold town room dreams of a woman in blue, her veil bright as the morning sky, who takes her hand and leads her through a doorway into a warm chamber where her children laugh without hunger. When the widow wakes, there is bread at the threshold, left, perhaps, by a kindly neighbor, but to her it is the Virgin's own doing. Saintly visitations could come as comfort, as warning, or as command. There are records in monastic chronicles of brothers who dreamed of Saint Benedict urging them to repair a crumbling wall before winter storms. Of nuns who claimed Saint Catherine appeared to strengthen their resolve in fasting. To dream of a saint was to be touched by a kind of authority. The dreamer might be sought out for counsel, or burdened with a pilgrimage to fulfill the vision's request. Some wore a token from the dream, a ribbon, a stone, a bit of cloth, to keep its blessing near. Others made offerings at the saint's shrine, believing it was a small repayment for the visit. But such dreams were not always received with untroubled joy. The Church warned that the devil could disguise himself in holy form, testing the faithful with false visions. Priests taught that a true saint's message would align with Scripture, and that a feeling of deep peace, rather than pride, was the mark of a genuine visitation. I have stood beside dreamers in these moments, watching their faces change from sorrow to serenity as the saint's presence folded around them like a cloak. And I have seen others wake uncertain, their hearts restless, wondering if the words they heard were heaven's gift or a trick of the mind. Yet whether unquestioned blessing or tested faith, such dreams carried weight. By morning, the world might look the same, but to the dreamer, the path ahead felt altered, lit by a light they could not see, but could still feel warming their steps. It is easy to imagine the church in perpetual vigil, candles burning without pause, voices rising in psalm through every hour. And yet, even in the most devout houses, there were stretches when silence reigned, and the holy places surrendered to the stillness of sleep. I have wandered through such moments. In a cathedral town, the bells had ceased after Compline, the last service before bed. The nave lay in darkness, its vaults holding the day's echoes like a shell holds the sea. The clergy had retired to their chambers, and the only sound was the faint ticking of cooling stone as it released the warmth of the day. In monasteries, the rule of Saint Benedict ordered prayer through the night, but between the hours there were intervals when every cell was quiet, and the cloisters empty but for the moon's shadow across the flagstones. The brothers slept in rows, their heads turned toward the altar, their breaths weaving into one slow rhythm. There was a vulnerability in these hours. The church, so often seen as a bulwark against the world's dangers, was, just for a time, at rest, its guardians in the same dreaming state as the flock they served. In villages, the parish priest might be found asleep by the hearth, the sacramental chalice and host locked safely away, the church door barred against both weather and ill intent. This was when other hands sometimes moved. I have seen parishioners slip into the empty nave through side doors, to leave offerings or whisper prayers they would not speak before a living audience. In rare cases, mischief crept in too. Pilfered candles, stolen altar cloths, charms taken from saint statues to be used in secret rites. The church's sleep was also the time of holy dreams. Monks might see visions of angels or warnings of famine. Nuns might wake with psalms on their lips, claiming they had sung them in their dreams. Such visions were recorded with care, for they were seen as messages sent when waking ears could not listen. And when the bell rang for the next office, matins or lauds, the slumber ended as if it had never been. Candles were lit, voices rose, and the holy machinery turned once more. But for a few hours each night, the church lay folded in darkness, as mortal as any home of stone or timber, breathing in time with the sleeping world beyond its walls. Not all terrors of the medieval night came from without. Some were born in the tangled garden of the mind itself, watered by fatigue, hunger, guilt, or fear, and blooming when the body surrendered to sleep. These were the demons of the drowsing mind, unseen, but felt with a reality as sharp as any waking wound. I have watched the faces of sleepers twist as these inner shapes approached. A farmer dreams of a figure without a face, standing at the edge of his field, holding a scythe made of shadow. A merchant dreams of drowning in an endless black river, though he has never set foot on a boat. A child sees a creature crouched in the corner, whispering words they cannot remember upon waking. The medieval world had many names for such experiences. Some called them nox tenebrae, nights of darkness, believing they were the work of demons exploiting the soul's unguarded state. Others saw them as punishments for sins unconfessed, the mind turning its own guilt into monstrous form. Physicians, fewer in number but growing in voice, spoke of bad humors, indigestion, or the imbalance of bile and blood. And yet, these dreams carried weight beyond mere nightmare. The afflicted might wake sweating, their heart pounding, convinced they had been truly touched or spoken to. Some found marks upon their skin, scratches, bruises, that they swore had not been there the night before. Whether these were the sleeper's own doing in the throes of distress, or something more, was a matter for much dispute. To guard against such visitations, people turned to both holy and folk remedies. A psalm could be recited before bed. A crucifix hung within sight of the sleeper's eyes. A sprig of rue or rosemary beneath the pillow was thought to clear the mind of foul shapes. In some places, a bowl of clean water was left at the foot of the bed to catch and trap the shadows before they could climb upward. The danger was not only in the night itself, but in what lingered after. Repeated dreams of a certain figure or place could be taken as an omen of illness, betrayal, or death. Entire dream books were devoted to interpreting such visions, with elaborate instructions for turning bad signs into good. Fasting, pilgrimage, or the giving of alms. I have seen dreamers wake in tears, convinced they had wrestled with the devil himself. I have also seen them wake with a strange calm, as if the demon they faced was their own fear made visible, and in seeing it, they had survived it. The medieval mind did not draw a clear line between the inner and the outer world. A demon in the night might be the soul's own shadow, or an actual spirit come to whisper its poison. In truth, it mattered little. The fear was the same, and the relief upon waking, when it came, was a prayer in itself. In the sleeping towns and cloisters of the medieval world, silence was rarely complete. From towers of stone and timber, the bells spoke, sometimes in slow, measured tolls, sometimes in sudden bursts that startled the heart awake. Their purpose was more than the keeping of time. I have stood beneath them, feeling their voices move through the dark like ripples through water. At midnight, a bell might call the monks to matins, its sound a thread guiding them from their pallets to the chapel's cold pews. In some villages, a smaller bell, no larger than a man's helmet, was rung from the parish porch at the same hour, not for worship but for protection. For it was believed that sound could scatter spirits. Demons, witches, and restless souls were said to shrink from the peal of bronze. Storms, too, were thought to be broken by it, the rolling clap of thunder answered by a bell's defiant clang. In some places, bells were even blessed, sprinkled with holy water and anointed with oil, their ringing considered a prayer in itself. When plague or famine shadowed the land, bells rang more often, especially at night. Their tolls were a reminder to pray, but also a barrier, an invisible wall of sound meant to keep death from crossing into the homes of the faithful. And in the lonely countryside, shepherds carried small handbells to ring over their flocks before sleep, believing it would guard them until morning. Yet there were other, more curious customs. In certain towns, a bell was rung at dusk to signal the covering of the fire, when hearths were banked for the night to prevent flame from spreading. In the same breath, people said the sound drove away wandering spirits, as if both dangers, flame and phantom, could be handled with a single strike of metal. The sound carried far in the thin night air. Travelers on the road could hear it from miles away, a sign that they were not alone in the dark. For some, it was a comfort. For others, an unsettling reminder that danger was real enough to require such a ward. And then, Just as suddenly as it began, the ringing would cease. The silence that followed was deeper for having been broken, and the night would fold in on itself again. But in the minds of those who heard it, the sound lingered, like a shield still held aloft after the battle has passed. In the medieval world, fasting was not only of the flesh, it could be of the hours of rest. There were those who believed that to deny the body sleep was to sharpen the soul, keeping it in a state of readiness for prayer, repentance, and holy visions. These were the sleep-fasting saints. I have watched them in their cells. Beds untouched for nights on end, the single blanket folded neatly at the foot. Instead of lying down, they would kneel or stand, swaying gently with the rhythm of whispered psalms. The only light came from a single candle, guttering low, its flame stretching their shadow upon the wall. Some, like Saint Catherine of Siena, were said to rest no more than an hour or two at night, spending the rest in contemplation. Others took their inspiration from desert hermits, who saw the body as a restless servant to be mastered. In monasteries, there were brothers who, after the final prayers, would not return to bed, but walk the cloister in the cold, repeating the Jesus prayer until dawn. The practice was not without its cost. I have seen their hands tremble from exhaustion, their eyes rimmed red, their steps falter. Yet they regarded this weakness as proof of the body's submission, the spirit rising more freely in its place. In their writings, they spoke of a strange clarity that came in the hours when the rest of the world slept, a sense that heaven itself was nearer in the silence. Sleep fasting could be done for penance, in atonement for sins real or imagined. It could also be an intercession, offered for the healing of the sick, the safety of travelers, or the lifting of plague. The hours that others spent in dreams were given as a gift to God, the saint believing that wakefulness was itself a form of prayer. The Church admired such devotion, but also cautioned against its excess. Priors reminded their brethren that the body, too, was a vessel for divine work, and must not be broken in zeal. Yet even these warnings could not still the fervor of some, who viewed each moment of sleep as a morsel stolen from eternity. In the morning, these saints would join their fellows as if they had slept the same as any other, their faces pale but lit from within by some hidden fire. To the casual eye, they were simply weary, but I, who never sleep, could see the truth. They had walked the night in unbroken prayer, and the echoes of it clung to them like incense. In the medieval night, the moon was not only a light in the sky, it was a substance to be caught, drawn down, and drunk. Those who believed in her influence said she shed more than silver beams. She gave a hidden essence that could be gathered if one knew the way. This was moon milk. I have seen it made. A bowl of fresh milk, set out under a clear full moon, left uncovered so the light could fall directly upon it. The milk, white upon white, seemed to glow faintly, as if the moon had poured herself into it drop by drop. In the morning, it was taken before breaking the night's fast, believed to cure melancholy, sweeten the temper, and grant peaceful dreams. Some recipes called for herbs steeped in the moonlight alongside the milk, chamomile for calm, marjoram for joy, vervain for protection. Others mixed in honey, likening it to the nectar of the gods, and said it could restore a failing love or ease the pangs of childbirth. But there were darker beliefs as well. In certain places, it was whispered that to drink moon milk in the wrong phase was to court madness, that the mind would become too open, letting in visions it could not endure. Waning moons were especially feared, for they were thought to draw not only sickness from the body, but reason from the mind. There are tales of those who drank too deeply. A young man in a hill village, after taking moon milk 3 nights in a row, was found wandering the lanes at dawn, speaking in riddles he never recalled in waking hours. A widow in a coastal town claimed that after tasting it, she could hear the voices of the drowned whenever the tide was high. The Church, wary of practices that smacked of the old ways, discouraged the making of moon milk, though some priests quietly allowed it if done with prayers to the Virgin. In the countryside, where such customs were older than the nearest chapel, the drink was often taken in secret, the empty bowl washed clean before sunrise. Yet even among those who scoffed at it, the sight of a moonlit bowl of milk on a windowsill could give pause. The night was a time when belief itself was a kind of power, and few were willing to mock a custom that might hold some truth. I have tasted it myself, not for nourishment, for I have no need, but to know its weight on the tongue. It was cool, faintly sweet, and carried the quiet of the night within it. Whether it was blessing or folly, I will not say, but I remember the stillness around that bowl, and the way the moon's light seemed to thicken as it touched the surface. In the medieval night, there were beds where sleep came not as rest, but as a visitor too shy to linger. These were the beds of the mourner, places where grief had turned the straw sour and the air thick with remembrance. I have stood in such chambers. The sheets remain unwashed, still holding the faint scent of the departed. The pillow is untouched on one side, as though the absent sleeper might return before dawn. Candles burn low not for light, but for company, their wavering glow tracing the empty space again and again. Grief shaped sleep in strange ways. Some could not close their eyes without seeing the face they had lost, and so they sat awake until exhaustion took them. Others clung to the bed itself, burying their face in the blankets as if they might breathe the beloved back into being. There were those who called out in their dreams, waking to the echo of their own voice in the cold room. Customs for such nights varied. In some places, the mourner was not to sleep alone for the first 3 nights after a death, lest the spirit of the departed try to take them along. Friends or family would share the bed, their presence a barrier between the living and the newly dead. In other regions, a mourner might tie a black ribbon to the bedpost or place a piece of bread under the pillow, offerings to keep the spirit from disturbing their rest. The church offered prayers for the souls of both the dead and the bereaved, and sometimes urged mourners to change their sleeping place entirely, to break the hold of memory. Yet many resisted, for leaving the bed felt like a second loss. Dreams in the mourner's bed were watched closely. A vision of the dead smiling could be taken as a sign they were safely in heaven. A troubled or silent figure was cause for more prayers, alms, and fasting. Entire vigils could be inspired by a single such dream, the bed becoming both a place of sleep and a small, personal shrine. Time would soften the sharpness of grief, but the bed kept its memory. Even years later, when new sheets were laid and new warmth shared, the wood might creak in a certain way, or the blankets fall into a familiar hollow, and the mourner, now healed, would remember. And I, who have seen every kind of rest, know that the mourner's bed holds a kind of waking sleep, where one lies between 2 worlds, the one that remains and the one that has slipped away. In the medieval world, exile was not always marked by chains or guards. Often it was simply the absence of home, a sentence carried out in the long, cold spaces between one night's rest and the next. I have watched the exiled try to sleep. Some lay in the corners of strangers' barns, with the scent of animals heavy in the air and the straw thin beneath them. Others curled beneath hedgerows, their bodies wrapped in cloaks stiff with frost, the stars pressing close above like 1,000 unblinking eyes. The bed of the exiled was rarely the same twice. A sailor turned away from port might sleep on the open deck, rocked by waves that kept him half-waking. A banished knight might take shelter in a wayside chapel, using his cloak as both mattress and shroud. A widow cast from her husband's lands might share a single blanket with her children beneath the eaves of a kindly neighbor's shed. Sleep in exile was light, broken by every sound. The crack of a twig, the shifting of wind in the thatch, the distant bark of a dog, each one a reminder that safety was no longer certain. Dreams came in snatches, often carrying the dreamer back to familiar rooms. The creak of their own door, the smell of their hearthfire, the feel of their own bed's worn linen. Waking from such a dream could be as bitter as the exile itself. There were ways to soften the strangeness. Some carried a small object from home, a pillowcase, a strip of blanket, a carved wooden charm, and placed it near their head each night, as if the familiar scent or shape could anchor the soul. Others tried to mimic their old routines. The same prayers, the same way of folding clothes before lying down. But these were only shadows of comfort. The church taught that exile could be a holy trial, a chance for repentance and humility. Pilgrimage and penance often blurred into banishment, with the road itself becoming a moving bed, each night's rest a station on a long, uncertain journey. And yet, for those forced into it, Exile was less a path toward God than a lingering wound. I have stood by the beds, if they could be called beds, of the exiled, and I know this. Even in the deepest weariness, a part of them remained awake, listening for a voice to call them back, or for the sound of a door opening somewhere in the darkness. In the medieval night, there was no hour more wakeful than the vigil kept at a birthbed. For here 2 worlds touched, the world of the living and the world of the yet-to-be-born, and the passage between them was long, uncertain, and not without peril. I have stood in such rooms, where the air was heavy with heat despite the winter frost outside. Rushlights burned low, their flames trembling in the draft from the chimney. Women moved in quiet urgency, carrying basins of warm water, shifting blankets, muttering instructions that were as much prayer as they were command. Men, if present at all, waited beyond the door, pacing the cold yard. The bed was the heart of the room. The mother lay propped on pillows stuffed with straw or feathers, her hair damp with sweat, her hands gripping the edge of the sheet. Around her, midwives and kinswomen worked with practiced hands, offering sips of spiced wine or broth between the waves of pain. The hours stretched, marked only by the tolling of distant bells or the crowing of a restless cock. In some places, charms were tucked beneath the mattress. A sprig of rosemary, a coin bearing the image of a saint, a small piece of iron to ward off spirits said to prey upon mothers and infants alike. If the labor slowed, certain herbs were burned so their smoke might loosen the knots within. And always there were prayers, some from the church, some older, whispered in dialects that had never been written down. Sleep was a stranger in the birthbed vigil. Even those not tending directly to the mother dozed only in fits, their ears attuned to every change in breath, every sudden silence. The vigil was as much for the living as for the soul of the child about to enter the world. In times of danger, candles might be placed at the windows to guide the newborn spirit safely into the light. When at last the child's cry came, the room's tension broke like ice underfoot. Laughter, weeping, and whispered blessings filled the air. The mother was wrapped in clean linens, the infant swaddled and placed at her side. Only then did the watchers allow themselves to rest, but often their sleep came shallow and short, the echoes of the night's labor still pulsing in their ears. And I, who have stood at many such beds, know that the birthbed vigil holds a kind of wakefulness unlike any other, not born of fear alone, but of awe, for it keeps watch over the narrowest and most miraculous of thresholds. In the medieval world, the road was a bed as much as a path. For the pilgrim, every night was a new resting place, and every resting place was borrowed, never truly theirs. I have walked beside them as they sought shelter at the close of day. Sometimes it was a monastery's guest house, where the air smelled of bread and candle wax, and the beds, though hard, were clean. Other nights it was the bare ground beneath a hedgerow, a thin cloak pulled over shoulders while the stars kept their indifferent watch. The pilgrim's bed was often a shared one. In roadside taverns, travelers lay side by side in long wooden frames, the straw refreshed only when it grew too foul to bear. In barns, they curled near the animals for warmth, the steady breath of an ox or mule a strange comfort. On rare and blessed nights, a hospitable household might offer a pallet by the fire, the host's only request being a prayer offered at a particular shrine along the way. Such nights carried their own rituals. Boots were loosened to let the swollen feet breathe, cloaks folded to serve as pillows, water flasks refilled from the nearest stream. Those who traveled in groups often prayed aloud before sleeping, their voices blending into a low, soothing hum that covered the creaks of the strange room or the sighs of the open field. Yet rest was rarely deep. The road had its own dangers, thieves, wild dogs, sudden storms, and the pilgrim learned to keep a part of themselves awake, even in dreams. Many slept with their walking staves within arm's reach. Some tied their satchels to their wrists so no hand could take them unnoticed. The church blessed the pilgrim's journey, and along the major routes there were hospices built for the express purpose of offering shelter to the devout. Here, the beds were plain but safe, the walls painted with images of saints whose eyes seemed to follow the sleepers, as if keeping vigil in their stead. But I have seen the other side, too. The wet bed of trampled grass after a night in the open, the stiff limbs of a traveler who had not truly slept at all, the hollow look in the eyes of those for whom the road had become a penance beyond their strength. Still, in the morning they rose again. They shouldered their packs, tightened their belts, and set their faces toward the shrine or relic that drew them onward. And when they walked away, their bed, whatever shape it had taken, was left behind like a stone turned by the tide, soon to be covered again by the movement of others. In the stillness of the cloister, one might think that sleep would come easily. The walls are thick, the doors barred, the rules of the house firm and steady as the rhythm of the day. Yet even here, where every hour has its prayer, there are nights when rest will not take root. I have walked the midnight corridors of such places. The moonlight falls in narrow bands through high, unshuttered windows, striping the flagstones with silver. The air smells faintly of beeswax and stone. In their narrow cells, brothers or sisters lie wakeful, their minds pacing more restlessly than their bodies ever could. Some are troubled by doubt, questions they dare not voice by day, now swelling in the silence. Others are kept awake by grief for the world beyond the cloister walls. A dying parent, a lost friend, a village plagued by hunger. And there are those whose bodies simply will not yield, their limbs tense, their breath shallow, no matter how weary the spirit. Rules forbade idle wandering, yet a sleepless soul often found ways to move. A monk might walk the cloister walk in bare feet, counting each step in place of the rosary. A nun might sit by a cold window, watching the stars shift, letting the slow passage of heaven's lights soothe her thoughts. There were accepted remedies. Warm milk steeped with nutmeg or chamomile could be taken from the kitchen. A psalter might be read aloud until the eyes grew heavy. In some houses, the infirmarian kept a small store of poppy syrup, given sparingly to those most in need. But there was also the deeper counsel, that sleeplessness itself might be a summons. Saintly writings told of nights when God withheld rest in order to grant visions or insights. Thus, some welcomed their wakefulness, using the hours for prayer, weaving their solitude into the greater pattern of devotion. By the time the matins bell rang, the sleepless had often already risen, their eyes shadowed, their movements slow but deliberate. They took their place among the faithful as if the night had been as restful for them as for any other, their private vigils known only to themselves, and perhaps to the one they believed had kept them awake. And I, who have never closed my eyes, know that the cloister silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is a mirror showing the mind exactly what it would rather not see. In the medieval night, not all beds were made for sleep. There were places where rest was feigned, but the heart beat faster than in waking hours, and the darkness served as both shield and accomplice. I have stood in such lofts, where the air is sweet with hay and dust, and the timbers creak at the faintest movement. The loft is high above the barn floor, reached by a ladder worn smooth by years of climbing. Through the gaps in the roof, the moon slips in, painting pale stripes across tangled blankets. Lovers met here when the house was too watchful, the village too small for secrecy. Their bed was whatever could be pulled together in haste. Bundles of straw, a cloak folded twice, sometimes nothing but the warm press of bodies against the wooden boards. The loft had its own dangers. A careless step could send a bale tumbling. A cough or laugh too loud might wake the farmer below. Yet these risks only seemed to quicken the pulse, turning every sound from the night outside, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, into a reminder that the world was close but unaware. Sleep in such places was shallow, if it came at all. The lovers lay listening to each other's breathing, tracing the dim outline of a face or hand in the thin light. Some whispered promises. Others spoke of nothing, content only to share the same small square of shadow. By dawn, the loft returned to its ordinary life. The clatter of pails, the stamping of hooves, the smell of feed and dung rising from below. Blankets were folded, the ladder descended, and each went back to their rightful place as if the night had been ordinary. But in the straw there lingered the warmth of bodies, and in the air, the faint echo of words meant for no other ears. The church, had it known, would have called it sin, the neighbors scandal. Yet to the lovers themselves, the loft was a sanctuary, The hours stolen, they're more precious for being so few. And I, who have watched every kind of bed, know that the loft's rest is a different kind. A rest not of the body, but of the longing that keeps the heart awake. In the medieval world, there were beds that all knew would be left only once. They stood in the quietest room, often near the hearth, so that the dying might feel warmth until the very end. I have lingered in such rooms, watching shadows stretch across walls as the day fades. The bed is dressed not for comfort alone, but for dignity. The cleanest linens the household can spare, a pillow fluffed and laid beneath the head, the blankets smoothed by careful hands. At the foot, a small table holds a crucifix, a candle, perhaps a bowl of water blessed by the priest. Around the bed, family gathers in shifts. Some pray aloud, others sit in silence, counting breaths. In villages, neighbors may come to pay respects while the soul is still tethered to the body. The dying often drift between wakefulness and a kind of half-sleep, murmuring to unseen figures or to those long dead, their eyes opening now and then to find the faces of the living. The church's presence is strong here. A priest will come to give the last rites, anointing the brow and lips with oil, placing the host upon the tongue if the dying can still swallow. Psalms are recited in low voices, their rhythm steadying the room like the beat of a slow heart. And yet, for all its solemnity, there is a strange peace to the bed that waits for death. The labor of life has ceased. No more fields to till, no more debts to reckon. The hands that once worked now lie open upon the blanket. Sleep and death are close companions here, one leading gently to the other. Some slip away in quiet, their last breath so soft it seems no different from the one before. Others linger for days, their bodies light but their spirits unwilling to depart. Those who keep watch often speak of the moment when the dying finally yield, a loosening, as if the knot binding them to the world has been untied. When the end comes, the bed becomes a bier. The body is washed, dressed, and laid out for the final vigil, the same candlelight now shining over a still face. And in time, the bed itself may be dismantled or its linens burned, for no one wishes to rest in a place where death has slept. I have stood by many such beds. They are neither wholly feared nor wholly welcomed, but they are always respected, for in them the last sleep begins. Illness was a common guest in the medieval bed, and it did not always wait for daylight to make itself known. The night was its favored hour, when the fire burned low, the air cooled, and the mind, unguarded by the distractions of the day, became fully aware of the body's distress. I have been present in such rooms, where the fevered twist in their blankets, murmuring to themselves or to people unseen. Sweat darkens the linen, yet the sufferer shivers, teeth chattering despite the heat that radiates from their skin. Beside them, a bowl of water grows warm from the repeated dipping of cloths meant to soothe, though the relief never lasts long. In villages, the remedies were as much prayer as they were medicine. A sprig of blessed rosemary might be tied to the bed frame, a charm sewn into the pillow. Broth was offered in small sips, or ale if water was distrusted. Some placed coins, 3 for the Trinity, beneath the mattress, believing they would draw the sickness out. Others burned herbs in the hearth, their smoke drifting toward the bed like an unseen hand pushing the illness away. The night magnified the sounds of sickness. Every cough seemed sharper, every groan more urgent. The cries of a child in fever could wake the whole household, each person taking turns to sit beside the bed. Outside, even the animals might stir uneasily, as if the distress within the walls had bled into the air around them. Fevers were feared not only for the body's suffering, but for the visions they brought. I have heard the delirious speak in languages they did not know, or describe journeys through places they had never seen. Some claimed to have glimpsed saints offering cool water. Others cried out against unseen creatures pressing upon their chests. These fever dreams blurred the line between the natural and the supernatural, and so they were listened to closely, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as blessings. By dawn, the night's cries might fade, leaving the patient pale and exhausted, their sheets damp and their watchers hollow-eyed. Or the cries might stop for another reason, and the house would fall into a silence that no one wished to break. In time, the fever's cause might be forgotten, but its night would be remembered. The long hours, the heat and chill, the strange things said between waking and sleep. Such memories clung to the bed long after, as if the illness had left its shadow behind. There is a sleep in the medieval world that knows no fear, no burden of conscience, no shadow from the day's toil. It belongs to the very young, whose bodies give themselves wholly to rest, and whose dreams are shaped not by worry, but by wonder. I have stood beside such beds, low cradles carved from oak, their sides smoothed by the hands of generations. In wealthier homes, they are lined with linen, the hems embroidered with charms against the evil eye. In humbler cottages, they are cushioned with lamb's wool or scraps of worn cloth, sweetened with a sprig of lavender or meadowsweet. The child sleeps with limbs loose and breath deep, their face soft in a way that will never return once the weight of the world begins to press upon it. They do not stir at the creak of a door, nor at the wind rattling the shutters. Their dreams, if they dream at all, seem to pass like clouds across a bright sky, gentle, fleeting, untroubled. Mothers and grandmothers sometimes watch over this rest, not because it is fragile, but because it is precious. They hum to the child in low tones, songs whose words are older than the church's walls. A hand might rest lightly on the child's chest, feeling the rise and fall as proof that all is well. There were customs to guard this innocence. A knife or pair of iron scissors might be laid beneath the mattress, to keep away fairies or wandering spirits said to be drawn to the pure of heart. The sign of the cross might be traced in the air above the cradle each night. And in some places, a candle was left burning until midnight, so that no darkness could touch the child's dreams. When they wake, it is sudden and complete. Eyes wide, limbs stretching, mouth opening in a yawn that turns to a cry for food or comfort. The sleep of the innocent leaves no shadow. It gives back more than it takes. And I, who have seen every kind of slumber, know that this rest is the rarest, for it is untouched by the knowledge that makes older sleepers turn in their beds. Once lost, it cannot be reclaimed, but it can be remembered and watched over and cherished while it lasts. Not all nights in the medieval world were measured by the turning of bells or the crow of the cock. Some stretched so far that the soul began to doubt the dawn would ever come. I have kept watch through such nights. The air outside is still, as if the very wind has grown weary. Inside, the fire has burned down to a bed of coals, their dull glow barely touching the walls. The sleepers turn and turn again, caught between dreams and waking, unsure of which is which. The longest nights often came in winter, when the sun set early and rose reluctantly. To those with no candles left, darkness claimed not only the hours of rest, but the hours one might have spent in work or talk. In such nights, the bed became a vessel adrift on a sea of shadow, and the mind its lone passenger. For some, this was a time of peace, hours to sink into warmth, to let the body mend from the day's labor. For others, it was a time of unease, when every creak of timber or sigh of the wind pressed in on the imagination. A dream could seem to last an entire lifetime. A single waking thought could loop endlessly until the first pale hint of morning. The poor passed these nights in close quarters, bodies pressed together beneath as many layers as they owned. The wealthy endured them in high, cold chambers, where tapestries and furs muffled some of the chill but could not banish the sense of isolation. Monks and nuns, bound to their nightly offices, marked the darkness in ordered segments, their chants a slow metronome against the unchanging black. In certain years, when famine, plague, or war had stripped the land bare, the longest nights were felt more keenly still. Hunger kept the belly restless. Fear kept the mind from closing its eyes. In such seasons, the dawn was more than a change of light. It was proof that the world still turned, that time had not stopped altogether. I have seen faces change in the longest night. Lines deepen, eyes grow distant, a stillness settle that is not entirely born of sleep. And when at last the sky begins to pale, there is a kind of disbelief, as though the light has returned too suddenly, too gently to be real. But it is real. The frost melts on the thatch, the cocks crow, the village stirs. And though the longest night may come again, it will always be followed by morning. And so we have wandered through dream and ritual, through superstition and sacredness. We have lain beside peasants in their straw-filled pallets, and in the curtained beds of nobles. We have walked with monks by candlelight, and with pilgrims beneath the cold stars. We have heard the croak of the dream-guarding toad, traced the comb's path through sleepless hair, and listened for the bells that drive back the unseen. These were not merely customs. They were prayers, not merely habits, but quiet resistances against the unknown, small shields against the vast dark that pressed on every roof and wall. Each act, whether born of faith, fear, or love, was a way of making the night more human. Now the journey's lamps grow dim. The beds we have visited fade back into the folds of time. The sleepers turn away from us and return to dreams that are theirs alone. The wind outside softens. Somewhere, a single candle still burns, and beyond it, the moon watches in silence. If this journey has eased your waking hours, I welcome you to return again, when night unfolds once more. I am the Watcher, and I will be waiting always